In 1943, America's most advanced weapon was a catastrophic failure. Bomber crews were dying by the thousands. Their bombs almost never hit their mark. On paper, the strategy looked brilliant. High altitude, daylight precision bombing guided by a secret mechanical marvel, the Norden bombsight. In practice, it was a disaster, formations ripped apart by flak and fighters, missions returning with ruined planes and empty claims, accuracy stuck in the single digits. Commanders clung to doctrine while men burned. Then, against every manual and every expectation, one crew made a wrong turn, a desperate gamble, and that mistake would teach them how to turn the wind into a weapon and change the air war forever. March 1943. Lieutenant James Howard's B-17 had been crawling through hostile skies for hours. One silver ship in a humming, seemingly endless bomber stream, frost rimed the windows. Faces were pale under dials and low light. Anti-aircraft bursts stitched the clouds, and fighters prowled the flanks. Radio chatter snapped orders and corrections. Formation kept them alive. Discipline kept them honest. Ahead, the target waited distant, defended, and the reason every man aboard had climbed into that cold, roaring metal coffin. He flies the run like a metronome, steady, straight, Norden locked, releasing with the calm of a man who's done his job 1,000 times. Then the sickening distance. Explosions bloom a half-mile away from where the crosshairs had promised impact. The crew stares, mouths open. Instruments say perfection. Reality says otherwise. A complete miss. Howard's experience wasn't a fluke, it was the rule. On one mission, 228 B-17 seconds went out, with everything riding on a single run, and only about 8% dropped their bombs anywhere near the target. Think about that. Almost the whole force scattering tons of explosives and coming home with hollow victory claims, while crews paid with their lives. The Norden, the doctrine, the whole idea of daylight precision felt like a lie. Bombs that should have crippled factories detonated in fields and towns. Command couldn't chalk this up to bad luck anymore. A systemic failure was staring them in the face. Then the brutal truth finally hits the people running the war. The whole idea of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing, the doctrine everyone staked lives and factories on, is a deadly, costly illusion. Plans, production schedules, and the lives of young crews were predicated on hitting a tiny bullseye from 20,000 feet. Instead, men are dying in waves, and tons of explosives scatter harmlessly across the countryside. For commanders, this isn't a technical glitch, it's an existential failure that shreds trust in strategy, forces frantic after-action accounting, and creates an urgent, terrifying question. How do you fix a war when your core weapon won't do what you were promised? Officially, precision meant something very specific. Drop your bombs into a circle 1,000 feet across, centered on the aim point. That was the standard, the metric the Air Force used to judge a mission, the promise commanders made to industry and the public, and the feat the Norden bombsight was supposed to deliver. 1,000 feet was theoretically tight enough to cripple a factory, punch through a roof, or take out a gun emplacement. It became the yardstick for training, commendations, and mission planning. On paper, it looked achievable. In the air, it would turn out to be brutally optimistic. But the truth was uglier than the manuals admitted. Instead of landing inside a 1,000-foot circle, American bombs were straying an average of 3,000 feet, roughly the length of a city block. Targets meant to be shredded ball-bearing plants, bridges, rail hubs were barely nicked, while towns and farmland paid the price. Tons of explosives, weeks of planning, and crews who volunteered for precision came home with nothing to show for it. It wasn't just disappointing. It was a strategic failure that turned carefully plotted raids into scattershot, deadly roll calls, and it set the stage for a mission that would expose the problem in full. The infamous Schweinfurt raid makes the crisis real. A fleet of nearly 300 B-17 seconds, America's pride, launches toward Germany to smash its critical ball-bearing factories, the tiny parts that keep tanks, planes, and guns running. It's a simple, brutal plan. Send everything up, hit the factories, and cripple the enemy. They're walking into a narrow gauntlet of flak and fighters. In the sky above Schweinfurt, heroism met futility. Fleets of B-17 seconds steamed in, metal and courage against concrete factories. Anti-aircraft carved the air. Fighters tore formations apart. When the smoke cleared, the results were horrifying. Bombs scattered like broken hail, most of them screaming into residential streets and open fields, not the factory roofs they'd been sent to kill. Hangars and homes burned. Medics worked with paper-thin supplies. Hundreds of American airmen never came home. Whole crews vanished into the sea or into blackened ruins. The price was paid in young lives, and the factories, disturbingly, kept on turning. The damage reports come back like a punch in the gut. The factories the mission was meant to cripple are humming again within weeks. Men who survived the raid watch supply lines keep moving. Cities pick up the pieces. Hundreds of American airmen never come home, and the tally of lost planes, crews, morale makes the whole operation read like a strategic catastrophe. Command is left with more than grief. They have a gnawing, urgent question. How could such a massive, costly raid change nothing? The answer should have been obvious. Except it wasn't, because the United States had a secret, supposedly flawless weapon of its own. It makes no sense on paper. The 8th Air Force is bleeding crews and missing targets, yet tucked into the nose of each B-17 is a marvel, the Norden bombsight. Picture a tiny mechanical brain, all gears and gyros, an analog computer built to outthink wind and speed, to steady the bomber's aim and turn men into surgeons of the sky. It was secret to the point of obsession, treated like national treasure. If anything could make daylight precision bombing real, this was it. So why, with that machine on every run, were bombs still landing miles off? The contradiction hangs like a question mark over the whole strategy. The Norden wasn't just another gadget, it was a wartime legend wrapped in secrecy, so hush-hush and so expensive that people compared it to the Manhattan Project. So secret, so costly. Each bombsight cost more than a suburban house, a miracle of gears and glass paid for like a small fortune. Parts were couriered under guard, test ranges ringed with sentries, and only a tiny circle of men even knew how it worked. It became less a tool and more a trust, the kind that turned crews into custodians, quietly bound to protect it at all costs, whatever the price. It was more than a piece of equipment, it was a sacred secret, built in silence and guarded like a national treasure. Bombardiers didn't just train on the Norden, they swore an oath. If the plane went down, they would die protecting it. And if they couldn't, they'd torch it themselves with a thermite charge, so no enemy could pry it open. Men repeated that promise in dim briefing rooms, fingers brushing the cold metal, knowing they'd rather be blasted to bits than let its guts be captured. They believed that machine was worth that vow, trusted it with their lives. On paper, the Norden looked like magic, a mechanical genius built to erase human error. It measured airspeed, altitude, and drift, ran those numbers through gears and cams, and then held the airplane perfectly steady on the final run. Bombardiers could lock the crosshairs, engage the bombsight, and in theory, the bombardier's only job was to press the release. It even coupled into the autopilot, keeping the bomber straight and level while the device did the thinking. That promise of foolproof precision is why the Norden was so jealously guarded and why its failures would later feel so inexplicable. For years, the Norden had been treated like a reliquary, secret, sacred, and infallible. It was supposed to turn a bomber crew into a surgical team, math and engineering, doing what courage alone could not. So why, time after time, did raids scatter shells across towns and fields instead of factories? Why did trained bombardiers swear by the sight and then watch their bombs land thousands of feet away? Officers scratched their heads. Strategy memos grew frantic. Men whispered that the technology must be lying. The contradiction was impossible on paper and deadly in practice. There had to be an explanation, and it was closer than anyone suspected. Unbeknownst to the Allies, the Germans already had the answer. Back in 1938, years before American crews were trusting their lives to the Norden, German agents had stolen the complete plans. Every gear ratio, every calibration chart, even maintenance notes and manufacturing tolerances. It wasn't a rumor, it was a blueprint in German hands. For half a decade, engineers and technicians could strip the bomb sight down, test it, and watch how it behaved in the lab. That quiet theft bought the Luftwaffe an invisible head start, an intimate knowledge of America's secret aiming device that would turn up not admiration, but a very different kind of conclusion. They tore the Norden down piece by piece, and, at first glance, you could understand the awe-exquisite optics, precise gyros, gears machined like watchwork. In a quiet lab, feeding at perfect airspeed and steady altitude, it promised miracles. But the Germans didn't see a miracle. They saw a fragile promise that only worked under ideal conditions. In the open sky, under flak bursts, fighter attacks, smoke, shifting winds, the Norden's assumptions collapsed. Brilliant in theory, useless in the crucible of combat. That verdict would prove decisive. Rather than try to out-engineer the device, Germany would learn to destroy the very conditions it needed to work. The first major problem was German defenses. In a matter of minutes, dozens of smoke canisters could turn a factory into a black, smeared blot on the landscape. Bombardiers, staring through the Norden, watched their aim point vanish. Optical fixes meant nothing. With the target swallowed, the bomb sight's precision was moot. Crews were left guessing, hoping, and watching perfect runs dissolve into wasted explosions. But the real killer wasn't enemy guns, it was the Norden's rulebook. That brilliant mechanical brain only worked if the airplane behaved like a ruler, dead straight, perfectly level, heartbeat steady for up to 3 minutes on the final approach. No banking, no weaving, no sudden corrections. The bomb sight needed a calm horizon, a steady airspeed, and an unchanging drift to solve its complex math. In practice, that meant a lumbering, predictable path through the sky, a tactic designed to make iron fall on steel, but which also handed the Luftwaffe a target on a platter. But that straight, predictable flight turned a multi-million-dollar B-17 into a slow, perfect target for German anti-aircraft guns. Steady at one altitude, level and exposed, the bomber was forced to ride into exploding clouds of shrapnel and tracer fire with nowhere to hide. What was meant to guarantee hits instead handed the enemy a sitting duck on a silver platter. Germany's 88mm flak cannons, tracked by radar, turned the sky into a lethal sieve. Predictors plotted bursts, and at 18,000 feet the air erupted into black, ragged clouds of shrapnel, screaming steel that peeled skin and tore wings. Bombers flew into a storm of tracer and debris. It was the moment every crew dreaded: follow the straight run and die, or break formation and guarantee a miss. The guns and the smoke left no illusions. To use the Norden, you had to fly straight and level a slow, predictable line into flak. Crews faced a brutal, almost impossible choice. Follow procedure and be cut down, or break formation, weave for survival, and guarantee their bombs would miss. Commanders could no longer pretend the trade-off didn't exist. Commanders reacted fast: climb. Whole bomber streams were shoved up to 25,000 feet beyond the lethal reach of the 88mm guns and their deadly flak belts. For a moment it felt like safety. Engines howled, crews gasped at the thin air. But that refuge came at a cost above the flak. An invisible force waited to rip apart their accuracy. Climbing to 25,000 feet solved one problem, but created another. Waiting there, unseen and savage, was the jet stream, a furious river of air that howled across the sky. It didn't care about bomb sights or doctrine. It shoved the whole aircraft sideways, wiped out painstaking drift calculations, and turned precise bombing into wild guesswork. What had been a nuisance became the deadliest enemy of the Norden. That invisible river of air wasn't a nuisance, it was lethal. At 25,000 feet, the jet stream blew like a conveyor belt, and the Norden simply wasn't built for it. It calculated wind head-on or tailing you, not a violent sideways shove. Suddenly, the bombsight's neat math unraveled. What had been a miracle became a tragic blind spot. Nobody had accounted for that brutal, invisible river of air. The Norden could compensate for headwinds or tailwinds, it could factor speed and altitude, and even steady drift, but it was never built to fight a fierce crosswind that shoved the whole airplane sideways during the bomb run. Imagine lining up a rifle, closing your eye, and feeling the ground slide under your feet. Nothing in the bombsight's math matched that lateral shove. The result was predictable and terrifying. The aiming point, the trajectory, the whole calculus of precision simply unspooled as the plane slid off course, an error no pilot could see in time. This sideways drift, the crab angle, turned everything the Norden promised into a cruel joke. The sight could correct for headwinds and tailwinds, calculate airspeed and altitude, even fly a steady final run. It never accounted for a wind that shoved the whole airplane sideways while the bombardier held a steady course. In practice, that meant bombs would sail miles off, not feet entire factories untouched, while towns took the fallout. It transformed precision into roulette. Either obey the sight, fly straight and be cut to ribbons, or break formation and live but guarantee a miss. That mismatch would soon doom raids like Schweinfurt. The second Schweinfurt raid lifts off into hell. Hundreds of B-17 seconds climb through German skies, but for the 305th Bomb Group, the mission unspools from the very start. Somewhere amid clouds and course changes, a navigator makes a fatal misread. A single miscalculation warps their heading. Instead of the expected approach, they're barreling in on a strange, deadly 40-degree angle. It begins with a navigator's clipped correction. The drift was wrong. A miscalculation of wind pushes the whole 305th onto a wild 40-degree approach, an angle so off course the formation looks tilted on the map. Lead planes scramble to correct. Radios crackle. Cohesion frays. What should have been a disciplined entry morphs into chaotic vectors, setting them up to fly straight into enemy fighters and deadly flak. As they close in, enemy fighters explode out of the clouds and knife into the formation. Planes dive and clang, gunners slap their turrets, and the sky fills with tracer and smoke. There's no time for a textbook. Straight and level run holding course would be suicide. Pilots peel off. Evasive maneuvers replace practice, and chaos instantly takes the place of precision. The formation is ripped apart by a storm of flak and screaming fighters. Black puffs bloom around wingtips, tracers stitch the sky, and engines cough as planes peel away, The lead ship takes the worst, flames licking a wing, cockpit alarms wailing, crew slammed against fittings as instruments flicker and radios garble. In that spinning, terrifying confusion, the entire bomb run collapses into chaos, and over the static, a single, impossible decision hangs on the intercom. The formation is a mess. Flak rips the sky, fighters everywhere. In the cockpit, alarms scream. Then, over the tinny intercom, a voice cuts through. An order so reckless it sounds insane. For a heartbeat, no one moves. Then the lead bombardier swallows his fear, nods, and reaches for the Norden, knowing this command could be their only chance to survive. Then a voice cuts through the chaos over the intercom. Calm, impossible. Do not aim at the factory. He freezes. A second later comes the rest. Pick a different landmark. Deliberately offset the aim point. It sounds insane. It feels like betrayal of everything they'd been taught. But there's no time for arguments. The bombardier's hands hover, then move. He swings the Norden's crosshairs away from the obvious target and locks onto a distant, harmless-looking reference point. Instead, an act of blind faith born of desperation. A gamble that the wind will do the rest. It sounds insane over the roar and the static. Ignore the factory, aim off to the side, and trust the fierce crosswind to shove the bombs sideways so they drift back onto the real target. It's a wild, desperate gamble, deliberately aiming wrong and letting the wind do the aiming, a single, dangerous instruction that could mean either brilliant success or total slaughter. He had no choice. He complied. His hands were steady, but his stomach wasn't as he cranked the Norden and centered the crosshairs on the strange, offset landmark. Training said aim at the target. This time he aimed away. For a long breath he sat frozen, then locked the sight and braced for the release. He tightens his grip, steadies the Norden, and lets go. The bombs drop, released on purpose at the wrong spot, a blind gamble against a furious sky. For a breath, the world seems to pause as metal falls into wind and chaos. He stares forward, turns the sight away, expecting another failure because this time the aim was faith, not certainty. The 305th wheels away, motors whining, formation ragged as they peel off into the gray. Bomb bays empty, faces go still. No cheers, just a hollow silence, and the small private prayers of men who know they've missed. They head home expecting the usual: bad photos, angry brass, graves. Hope is a quiet thing aboard this crippled sky train, barely dared, already braced for failure. Days later, in a cold, makeshift dark room behind the operations tent, the strike photos are developed and hung like evidence on a line, glossy squares under a single bare bulb, and the men whooped on the way in fall silent when they study them. What they expected to see were scattered craters, random civilian damage, the same failure they'd come to accept. Instead, the prints show neat, devastating patterns of blast and fire centered on the plants themselves. Faces go pale. Someone whispers, "How?" Phones start ringing up the chain. The results are astonishing and, for a moment, completely inexplicable. When the strike photos were finally developed, the numbers landed like a thunderbolt, while other groups on the mission limped home with the usual pathetic 8–12% of bombs anywhere near the target. The 305th's film read like a miracle, an almost impossible 42% hit rate. Men who had spent months cursing the Norden and the wind stared in stunned silence. A room used to failure suddenly held a figure that didn't belong to their experience. For a moment, disbelief hung in the air. Then disbelief shifted to a sharp, electric excitement, but no one yet knew how they'd pulled it off. When the strike photos are developed, they don't show scattering at random. They show a tight, devastating pattern of explosions cut clean across the ball-bearing factories, concentrated bursts on roofs, courtyards, and assembly lines, like someone had traced the plant with a row of miniature suns. These images contradict everything crews had been taught about precision. They are surgical, not sloppy. The pictures explain why the 305th's hit rate jumped wildly above the norm. This was no fluke. Back at base, officers pass the glossy frames hand to hand. Silence gives way to an electric realization that whatever happened over Schweinfurt just changed the rules. The debriefing was electric. Men crowded around a dim table, strike photos pinned like trophies and questions hanging in the air. At first, it felt impossible. The crew that had blundered approaching on the wrong axis, aiming at a landmark instead of the factory, had turned in the best results of the war. You could see skepticism and disbelief in equal measure. A few laughed, others stared at the films until their eyes went raw. Commanders scribbled notes, navigators replayed plots, pride warred with incredulity. For a moment the room was suspended between relief and outrage, because a mistake had done what all the machines and doctrine could not. The revelation hits them. They hadn't fought the wind. They had, completely by accident, weaponized it. For a long, stunned moment the room is quiet. Then the photos speak louder than doctrine ever could. A string of explosions, centered where everyone swore they couldn't be. Relief, disbelief, a bitter laugh or two. Men who'd watched comrades fall for the sake of a straight and level run suddenly see that survival and accuracy can be the same thing. It isn't luck. It's a leverageable fact. The discovery feels like finding a secret map in the middle of a battle, brilliant, terrifying, and urgent to understand and teach. Analysts scramble through maps, logbooks, and blown-up strike photos, running through calculations until their heads hurt. They model wind layers, replay bomb runs frame by frame, and the fog of confusion thins. What emerges is almost embarrassingly simple. If you fly at a fixed angle into a steady crosswind, the sideways drift stops being a random, mission-ruining nuisance and becomes a predictable, measurable offset. The chaos collapses into geometry. Suddenly, the problem isn't, why do bombs miss? But, how precisely can we measure the wind? That shift measurement over guesswork is the hinge that could change everything. The realization was simple and strange. The wind stopped being the enemy and began to behave like a machine. Imagine a conveyor belt in the sky, a steady crosswind that, instead of scattering bombs at random, nudged them all the same direction, carrying each payload in a tight, predictable line from a deliberately offset aim point straight onto the factory. What looked like chaos became geometry. What looked like luck became repeatable technique. Suddenly, those wild, drifting patterns turned into concentrated strikes, and the entire equation of high-altitude bombing shifted a breakthrough that would make measuring that wind, above all else, mission-critical. Suddenly, the most critical job in the bomber wasn't the bombardier's steady hand. It was the navigator's ability to read and measure the wind with surgical precision. A few miles per hour off, and the whole run vanished. A perfect aiming point became worthless. So navigation stopped being about maps and headings and became about timing, citing ground references, and turning invisible air into predictable math. These men learned to watch the ground like surgeons, to take quick, brutal fixes, to convert gusts and currents into numbers the bombardier could trust. The shift was quiet, invisible, but it would remake the way air war was fought. They called it the double drift, a simple, brutal workaround that turned the navigator into the flight's true sniper. During the bomb run, the navigator would take one drift sighting on a ground feature, note the plane's heading and ground speed, then a short time later, take a second sighting on a different landmark. From those two observations, they could solve the wind vector, direction, speed, and the exact crab angle their bombs would experience. It was hands-on math in a shaking, freezing cockpit, done while flak blossomed below, but it made the invisible wind into a predictable force the bombardier could exploit. By mastering the double drift technique, navigators suddenly had a tool sharp enough to cut through chaos. Skilled crews could measure wind to within 5 miles per hour. 5 miles. That tiny margin turned an invisible, murderous force into something you could bank on. Instead of guessing where the bombs would land, crews could predict the drift, pick an offset, and let the wind line the explosives up with the real target like a conveyor belt. What had felt like luck became repeatable skill. In the span of a few weeks, that small improvement would change everything and send analysts scrambling to understand how it worked. They didn't wait. Planes were pulled from the line, navigators and bombardiers briefed, cameras and photo recon teams primed to catch every burst. Crews flew the new technique in real combat conditions: flak, fighters, freezing altitudes, brutal crosswinds, not in a quiet lab. Navigators ran their double drift readings, bombardiers aimed off target on purpose, and strike films were developed under a hush. The pattern that emerged was impossible to argue with. Tight, repeatable clusters of explosions where they wanted them. The results were not tentative or lucky, they were staggering, conclusive, and they demanded immediate adoption. They put theory to the test: brutal, methodical runs designed to answer one simple question: could you use the wind instead of fighting it? The result was immediate and shocking. By flying at a 45-degree offset, crews saw their average miss shrink from more than 3,000 feet to roughly 1,100 feet. That's not a marginal gain. It's the difference between scattering bombs across a town and punching a concentrated pattern onto a factory. Men who had been taught to curse the wind now stared at strike photos and realized they'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a trick. They'd found a way to make inaccuracy predictable. It was more than a statistical victory, it was proof that the impossible was suddenly possible. What had been a terrifying 3,000-foot lottery now tightened to nearly the 1,000-foot circle they'd spent years chasing. Bombs that once fell harmlessly into fields were now landing where planners had intended. Morale shifted overnight. Navigators became the new keystone. Training and wind tables replaced guesswork. Commanders who doubted the Norden's promise now saw a tool that could punch holes in enemy industry and save crews from pointless runs. The revolution wasn't theoretical anymore, it was happening, fast, and the Air Force had to learn to fly, aim, and think differently before the next mission. January 1944. General James Doolittle, ace showman, and now the commander of the 8th Air Force, made a decision that read like a dare. He looked at the maps, the strike photos, the stubborn math, and ordered a total, unconditional reset. Retrain every crew on the new offset technique, fast, ruthless, and without excuses. Not next month, not when the weather cleared. He gave them 6 weeks. 6 weeks to unlearn instinct, relearn judgment, and turn a lucky accident into doctrine. It was audacious, it was terrifying, and it set a clock that would beat straight into the heart of the coming invasion. General Doolittle issued an impossible order: retrain the entire 8th Air Force on this counterintuitive offset technique in 6 weeks. 6 frigid weeks, while the war raged. No idle classroom experiments. Crews would be learning under fire, swapping instincts for a rule that told them to aim away in order to hit. The clock was merciless. The stakes were higher than pride. Failure would cost lives and imperil the next operations. The challenge is immense. Every instinct these crews have been drilled with fly straight, hold your line, trust the bomb sight now has to be unlearned and reversed. The idea of deliberately aiming away from the target feels insane. It flies in the face of everything a bombardier has been taught and every nerve the pilots have in their hands. And there's no time for debate. Doolittle has given them 6 weeks. 6 weeks to twist training into a miracle and turn a disastrous weapon into a precision tool, all before the largest invasion in history depends on them. Can they do it? Training is brutal, conducted in the harsh, freezing English winter. Men live in damp Nissen huts, breath fogging in the dim light, as instructors bark corrections. Crews fly mock runs into biting winds, time their turns, measure drift, and rehearse the counterintuitive ritual of aiming away. Lessons come fast, cold, and unforgiving. And crucially, they're taught not by theorists, but by veterans who learned this in combat. The program worked for one simple reason. It wasn't theorists lecturing pilots about ideal conditions. It was combat veterans teaching combat veterans. These instructors didn't quote lab results. They showed blood-stained photographs, body counts, maps scribbled in frost, and the exact mistakes that had saved lives. Their authority came from suffering, not paper, and that changed everything. When a man who'd been shot up over Schweinfurt told another man where to look and how to fly, he didn't need charts. He needed to be believed. That trust turned impossible theory into a brutal, teachable craft, taught, in fact, by the very men who discovered it. They weren't professors in suits. They were the men who'd bled for the idea, the 305th crews who stumbled into the technique at Schweinfurt, and now they stood up in front of other bomber crews as instructors. That changed everything. When a teacher had the same haunted look, the same ripped flight jacket, the same strike photos tucked into his pocket, skepticism evaporated. They spoke in mission time and wind readings, not theory. They could point to a ruined factory and say, "We did that." Their lessons were brutal and believable, delivered with the hard authority that comes from surviving the very chaos they were trying to teach others to master. In freezing Nissen huts, war-weary men huddled under oil lamps and dot matrix heaters, the air smelling of coal and cigarette smoke, while the 305th survivors became teachers. They didn't hand out textbooks. They brought scars, logbooks, and the grim-proof mission data stripped down to numbers, and strike photos with black splotches where buildings used to be. Fingers jabbed at images. Voices were low, urgent, no theory, just cold evidence. "We aimed here, the wind carried it here, look." The room cracked between skepticism and awe as crews saw in stark monochrome exactly how a mistake had turned into a method. Skepticism hangs heavy in the cold air pilots, with decades in the cockpit, jaws set, refusing to accept aiming away from the sight they'd trusted for years. The instructors don't plead. They lay out the work. Strike photos, sortie logs, time-stamped drift readings spread across a table like evidence in a trial. Fingers trace crater clusters and lines of shattered steel. Quiet follows the pictures. Faces that scoffed moments before go still as the numbers add up, as the pattern stares them in the face. The proof is physical, visual, and brutal. Debate dies and curiosity takes its place. They hold up 2 photos. Here's a traditional bombing run with 9% accuracy. Here's our offset run with 38%. The numbers hit like a punch. One picture is a scatter of puffs and empty sky. The other is a tight, brutal line of explosions right on the factory. No arguments, no whiteboard math, just clear, brutal evidence that the accidental method worked. The hut goes quiet. Men who've seen friends torn from the sky stare at those frames and feel the weight of proof settle over doctrine. Still, stubbornness lingers. Not everyone will change overnight. Even after the instructors held up those strike photos like evidence in a courtroom, not everyone was convinced. A handful of grizzled, combat-hardened pilots listened politely, then shrugged off the whole thing too radical, too counterintuitive, they said. Decades of training and a lifetime of hard lessons had taught them one simple rule: point at the target and trust your eye. Telling them to aim away felt like blasphemy. They worried about gimmicks, about giving up control, about trusting a trick born of chaos. Their resistance wasn't stubbornness so much as survival instinct, and it would soon force a brutal choice. One veteran refused to bend. He insisted on flying the old way during a mission, trusting his instincts over the new technique. When the bombs fell, they landed a mile off a spectacular, costly miss. There was no dramatic court-martial, no public lecture. Instead, he was quietly reassigned to a non-combat role, pulled out of the fight. The silence around it spoke volumes, and it set the stage for what General Doolittle would soon make brutally clear: adapt or get out of the way. Doolittle's message was brutally clear: adapt to the new reality or get out of the way. He turned a laboratory curiosity into an iron command, retrained the entire 8th Air Force on offset bombing in 6 weeks, and do it while we're still fighting. There would be no slow academic debates, no room for sentimental attachment to old methods. Men who insisted on the old way were quietly reassigned. The survival of crews and the success of upcoming operations left no patience for naysayers. The order landed like winter steel, urgent, uncompromising, and it set the clock ticking on the biggest retraining effort the Air Force had ever attempted. By April 1000, or 944, the training blitz is complete. What felt impossible 6 weeks earlier is now doctrine. Squadrons that once trusted instinct now trust a calculated offset. The instructors from the 305th, the men who stumbled into the method at Schweinfurt, have turned battlefield luck into standardized procedure. Crews have relearned how to fly, how to navigate, how to aim away to hit true. Resistance has been broken not by theory, but by cold, hardened proof and hard training. The 8th Air Force moves as one machine now, and every mission briefing begins to revolve around one new obsession: the wind. Mission briefings changed overnight. No more vague guesses, no more hope. Crews now opened packets filled with detailed wind forecasts, maps of jet streams, and marching orders on exactly how to approach at an angle. Navigators stopped being background figures and became the mission's linchpin, armed with pre-calculated tables that turned messy crosswinds into predictable variables. Checklists grew longer. Radios hummed with precise drift numbers. Bombardiers practiced aiming at deliberately wrong points until it felt normal. What had been a lucky accident was now method and muscle cold. Scientific, rehearsed, and the whole system braced for its first war-defining test. What began as a fluke had been turned with almost scientific ruthlessness into doctrine. Checklists rewritten, mission briefings rebuilt around wind forecasts, navigators trained to measure drift to the mile and carry pre-calculated offset tables strapped to their knees. Crews drilled the maneuver until it became muscle memory. Instructors, the men who'd stumbled into the discovery, pushed it like gospel in freezing Nissen huts. Planes, men, and instruments were all reoriented to one paradoxical truth: you hit the target by aiming away from it. Now the training wheels were off. The procedure was organized, tested, and standardized. The only question left was whether this new system could survive the biggest, most dangerous test of all: D-Day. Everything hinged on the 8th Air Force. 50,000 troops would land under the guns of 49 concrete reinforced artillery batteries dotting the coast. and those guns had to be silenced first. This wasn't about carpet bombing factories or breaking supply lines. It was surgical, brutal, and almost impossibly precise. For the men in the bombers, years of theory and one accidental breakthrough now faced their ultimate exam. If the bombs fell true, the beaches would be manageable. If they missed, the landings would become a slaughter. The sky held 60 million pounds of fate, and there was no second chance. They have a tiny 40-minute window, 40 minutes, to drop nearly 3,000 tons of bombs onto tiny, concrete-reinforced gun emplacements before the first boats hit the sand. It's a monstrous weight in a sliver of time. Every second matters. Every run must be right. Misses mean the landing beaches will meet steel, not silence. The weather on invasion day turned everything fragile. That tiny 40-minute window still existed, but heavy low clouds forced the bombers down from safer heights straight into the lethal reach of German flak. Black puffs of shrapnel bloomed at their altitude. The straight, steady runs the Norden demanded now looked like open invitations to be torn apart. Visibility crashed to near zero as crosswinds waited to finish the job. Winds howl, clouds swallow the horizon. At low altitude, the flak is only a few thousand feet below, and visibility drops to almost nothing. Silhouettes, not targets. Every instinct screams to abort. Instead, crews lock into training. Navigators chew numbers, running rapid double drift checks, while bombardiers set the Norden to an offset solution they've drilled until it feels like muscle memory. It's cold, chaotic, terrifying. But there's a momentum now. Procedure replaces panic. The accidental tactic is no longer a guess, but a practiced gamble, a plan to bend the wind to their will. They didn't aim at tiny concrete bunkers, they aimed at the coast. The entire shoreline became a huge, unmistakable reference, visible where small targets vanished in smoke and cloud. Crews set the Norden's crosshairs on a beach marker, measured the crosswind, and trusted the wind to sweep the bombs sideways onto the fortifications. What had been a needle in a haystack turned into a predictable, deadly line. At Utah Beach, the new tactic clicks into place. Bombers peel off to a precise 45-degree angle to the shoreline, eyes fixed on the coast instead of the concrete bunkers. For a breathless minute, they hold that offset, release on cue, and the sky erupts as thousands of pounds of ordnance cascade toward the sand, not blindly, but carried and concentrated by the wind they once feared. The result is devastating. In minutes, the coastline is transformed, concrete gun pits shredded, observation towers toppled, barbed obstacles and coastal batteries turned into smoking wreckage, and 89% of the German fortifications are destroyed or disabled just moments before the infantry hits the sand. Machine gun nests fall silent. Artillery crews are stunned or wiped out, and the first wave finds a beach stripped of the lethal network meant to stop them. What would have been a slaughter becomes, instead, a shattered landscape soldiers can actually fight across, buying precious minutes and momentum for the bloody struggle inland. But not every beach would be so lucky. At Omaha Beach, it all went sideways. After Utah's success, the lead bombardiers stared down at a crowded shoreline and a single terrifying thought. What if we hit our own men and craft? So they did the only cautious thing they could think of. They added a few seconds of delay to their bomb release, a tiny human hesitation that would prove disastrously consequential. At Omaha, fear translated into delay. Bombardiers held their breath and added a few seconds to the release. Those few seconds, compounded by the precise geometry of offset bombing, turned a surgical strike into a miss. The entire payload dropped harmlessly miles inland, leaving the men on the beach to face intact fortifications and a bloodier hell than anyone had planned. But at Omaha Beach, the calculus failed. On the lead run, bombardiers hesitated, adding just a few seconds to avoid hitting our own landing craft, and because offset bombing depends on precise timing and geometry, those seconds sent the entire payload harmlessly inland. Only 31% of the German defenses were struck. The bunkers and gun positions the infantry expected to be softened remained intact, and the men who went in after the bombs walked into the full, unbroken, horrific fury of the enemy machine guns blasting fields of fire untouched. Chaos on the sand as brave soldiers paid the terrible price of a mission that missed by inches and consequences that cost lives. D-Day proved, in blood, both the power and the precision of the technique. The beaches had been a test by fire. Utah showed what offset bombing could do. Omaha showed what small errors could cost. Where crews trusted the method, concrete turned to rubble. Where hesitation crept in, men paid with their lives. After the war, analysts crunched the numbers, and the results were brutal and clear. Offset bombing was roughly 3 times more effective at neutralizing hardened, reinforced positions than the old, straight-on runs. That cold statistical truth belied what survivors already knew: this accidental tactic had reshaped the brutal arithmetic of air power. By the time the smoke cleared, what started as a lucky mistake had become a strategic revolution. Overall bombing accuracy across the Air Force improved by an incredible 190%, turning scattershot raids into surgical, sustained attacks. German factories, once stubbornly resilient, could no longer hide behind smoke or distance. Their assembly lines were picked apart, supply chains strangled, and the enemy's ability to replace lost tanks, planes, and weapons collapsed. The air campaign had shifted from nuisance to annihilator, shortening campaigns and bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. That brutal efficiency didn't end with VE Day. It would be taught, adapted, and weaponized for every conflict that followed. That accidental trick didn't disappear with the armistice, it became doctrine. By the 1,950 seconds, every B-52 crew in Strategic Air Command learned to do the same math: measure the wind, pick an offset, fly the line, and let physics finish the job. Pilots practiced it until it was muscle memory, run in drills and simulators as a standard part of nuclear strike planning. It turned a battlefield improvisation into the backbone of Cold War, targeting a method that made delivering the most terrible weapons of the era feel terrifyingly precise. Brilliant, cold, terrifying, and quietly, it reshaped how air forces thought about accuracy for decades to come. When the fight shifted to Southeast Asia, the Navy and Air Force found themselves up against a different enemy: the monsoon. Sudden violent crosswinds and sheets of rain could turn a carefully calculated bomb run into a random scatter in seconds. So crews did what they'd learned to do best: they adapted. B-52 crews and tactical bomber units brought the offset method and the Navigators' double drift into the monsoon, measuring the wind, aiming off, and letting the atmosphere carry the munitions onto target. It didn't make the weather gentle. It made the bombing predictable again, another wartime hack turned doctrine, one that would survive into the missile age. When GPS-guided smart bombs arrived, it looked like offset bombing had finally been retired, a quaint relic of a dirtier, noisier air war. But technology brought new weaknesses. Jamming, spoofing, and outright denial turned satellites from infallible helpers into fragile windows you could close. So today, even B-2 stealth crews drill the old art's wind measurement, double drift fixes, 45-degree offsets, and dead-reckoning navigation, not because nostalgia demands it, but because redundancy saves lives when silicon fails. The surprising truth is simple. A technique born of a desperate mistake became a durable backup, one that still wins fights when the high-tech fails. It's a powerful reminder. The greatest innovations don't always come from tidy laboratories. Sometimes they explode out of desperate mistakes made under fire. A blown navigation, a frantic order, a crew that aimed somewhere else, and suddenly the wind, the very thing that was killing them, became their most precise ally. That lesson didn't vanish with GPS. It migrated into Cold War drills, into monsoon missions, into stealth tactics when satellites fail. Techniques born from error kept bombs finding their mark long after the Norden went silent. What other mistakes have secretly changed the course of history? If you want more stories like this, subscribe and I'll bring them to you.